Today we're going to be looking at a ton of custom Plants vs. Zombies plushes that are actually some of the best customs I've ever seen. As well, there's tons of different Plants vs. Zombies custom plushes, but I found a few that are just extremely good, so I decided to make a video about them. So yeah, we're going to get right into it and start off with the first one being the Primal Sunflower. Now, for basically every single one of these plushes, the material that's used on them is a felt material, so that could mean that the plushes actually could get damaged. But besides that, basically every single other part of the plush is just really high quality and they all look really good. As I'm on the face, they even added some extra little dots on it just to give it a bit more detail and make it look more accurate to the game, and they did a good job with the stitching on the eyes. The mouth also looks really good and is definitely one of the most detailed parts of the entire plush, and they just did a really good job with it. As well, they got all the colors right and everything, and it overall just looks really good. The petals around the head also look really good, and they all have lines on them just to give it a bit more detail, and a few of them actually have pieces of them cut out just to give it a bit more detail and make it look more accurate. There's also a few extra details on the side of the face just to give it a bit more detail, and it makes the plush just look slightly better. For the stem, they did a good job making the colors transition pretty well, and they look pretty nice. The leaves also all look really good, and you can see a few lines on the leaves just to give it a bit more detail. And while they all have the correct amount of leaves, and they look pretty good actually, as of all of them are kind of cut out differently just to give it a bit more detail so it looks a little better. But yeah, I have to say this is just a really good plush, and especially on the face with the mouth and everything, they just did a great job making all the details just look really nice. And well, for the next plush we have the Primal Potato Mine. Now, the eyes and mouth look pretty good. The mouth is nicely embroidered on it. I can't really tell if the pupils on the eyes are embroidered on or if they're just made out of a felt material, but either way, they look pretty good. The dirt base of the potato mine actually looks really good as well, but has some lumps in it just to give it a bit more detail so it could stand out a bit more and just to give it a bit more definition and everything. It also has a little bit of stitching on it just to give it slightly more detail. You can also see a few circles stitched throughout the plush that is on the potato mine, and that's just to give it a bit more detail, and it actually looks really nice. As well, even though it's just a really small detail, I still think it looks pretty good. And while the red parts on the Primal Potato Mine look pretty good, and they seem to be pretty nicely stuffed, and they look really nice. So yeah, they basically got every single detail on this plush accurate, and it looks really good. Next up we have the Hot Potato. Now, this is one of the only plushes that actually uses iron-on material for the plushes. With the eyes and everything, they seem to be made out of an iron-on material. And well, that also goes for the gray dots on the face as well. They seem to also be made out of an iron-on material, and even though they're made out of a pretty delicate material, they still look pretty nice. And well, Hot Potato is just a really simplistic character, so there's not really much to add about this plush. But I do like how they added the yellow and orange lines just to show the heat that is coming off of it as well. I think that's just a really nice detail that they added. As well, without that detail, the plush wouldn't really look that good in my opinion as well, but it would have just been really simplistic. Next up we have the EM Peach. Now, for the face on this plush is really simplistic, but that makes sense as well. EM Peach's face is just really simplistic, so that's why there's barely any detail to it. As well, all they really need to add is the eyes and the eyebrows, and that's what they did, so it looked pretty good. I do think that they should have made the eyebrows just a little bit bigger, but besides that, they did a great job with it. And well, for the antenna part of the plush, it looks pretty good, and it seems to either be really nicely stuffed or had some sort of metal rod in it to make it stand up like that. As well, to make it stand up like that, the plush would either have to be extremely well stuffed so it didn't fall over, or have something like a metal rod in it just to make it keep its shape. As well, if there wasn't something like a metal rod in there, over time it would lose stuffing and get understuffed, and it would end up looking pretty bad. But yeah, the ring around the antenna looks really good, and they actually did a great job with it as well. I'm pretty sure they just stitched it to the front and then the back of the loop, but I can't really tell. Next up we have the Charred Guard. Now, the face on this plush is just really small, which I think they should have just made it a little bit bigger, but besides that, the rest of the plush actually looks really good. And the branches actually have a bit of extra detail, adding the small branches to the side of them just to make it look a bit better. And well, for the leaves on this plush, they look really good and also have some extra stitching on them just to give them a bit more definition, make it a bit more detailed. And well, once again, I think they did a really good job with it as well, even though they just took the branches from each side and they basically only had to make one branch shape and just add it to the other side, so it was probably easier to make than most of these other plushes. It still looks really good. Next up we have the Celery Stalker. Now, both of the faces on this plush look really good, and they seem to be really nicely made, and they also seem to have some nice stitching on them. And well, once again, I'm pretty sure that they used metal rods for this plush as well, but the only way to really make this part of the plush stand up as well, but it doesn't really seem to have much stuffing inside of it, so I'm assuming they probably used something like a metal rod. As well, some companies like Linkson that make Plants vs. Zombies plushes actually used metal rods in some of their plushes, so I'm guessing that whoever made these custom plushes did that. And while the dirt on this plush also looks pretty good as well, there's some stitching on it just to give it a bit more detail and add some definition to it. So even though it's a really simplistic detail, it still looks really nice and they did a great job making it. So yeah, once again, just a really nice looking plush, and I'm glad that they added some extra stuff like stitching just to give it a bit more detail. Next up we have the Intensive Carrot. Now the face on this plush is really simplistic, but they did a great job with it as well. The Intensive Carrot has a very simplistic face, but they did a nice job with it. I also have no idea how they made the eyebrows as well. They made them in a really unique way, so I actually have no idea how they did that. For the stem on the carrot, they did a pretty good job with it as well, but it's just made out of some pieces of felt material, but they look really nice. And well, they added some stitching throughout the plush just to give it a bit more detail, and also added some extra plush material on top of the other plush material to give it a bit more detail. So yeah, even though Intensive Carrot is just a very simplistic character, they added all the details necessary and they did a great job with it. As well, I really like all the extra stitching they added, and I also like how they made other pieces of plush material to put over it just to give it a bit more definition and detail. Next up we have Stalia. Now, this plush actually has a lot of detail to it as well. The face looks really nice, and I'm glad that they actually added a purple tint to the eyes as well, but without the purple tint to the eyes, the plush just doesn't really look as good, so I'm glad that they did that. The only really bad part of the plush is that it's very hard to see details like the eyebrows as well, but basically fully blends into the rest of the plush. But besides that, the rest of the plush actually looks really good, and they did a great job with all the petals and everything as well. They made multiple different layers of petals just to give it a bit more detail. And this is definitely one of the most detailed plushes out of all of them as well. They made so many different layers of petals that you could barely even tell which is which, and they just did a great job with it. And while the leaves on this plush also just look really good as well, they have some stitching through them, and they're really uniquely shaped, so they look really nice. So that's just another really good detail that just makes this plush look even better. So yeah, this definitely has to be one of the most detailed plushes out of all of them. Next up we have the Rutabaga. Now for the leaves on this plush, they actually did a really good job with them, and they seem to actually be basically the exact same leaves as the Stalia plush. As well, they use very similar stitching and also have very similar shapes, so I'm assuming that's probably what they used them from. But yeah, the rest of the plush looks really good, and it has a few extra stitching on the white part of the plush under the leaves just to give it a bit more detail. I also really like the purple eyes on this plush as well, just like the Stalia. It gives the plush a bit more detail and it looks really nice. They also added some purple dots to the face to once again just to give it a bit more detail and make the plush just look slightly more accurate. As well, even though they're just really small details, the small details either make or break a plush usually. And well, for the root on the bottom of the plush, it looks pretty good and it seems to be really nicely stuffed. So yeah, they just did a really good job with this plush and basically made every single detail that was necessary. So yeah, overall, just once again, a really nice looking plush and one of the more detailed ones. Next up we have Stunyon. Now, the eyes and mouth on this plush actually look really good as well. They're very simplistic, but they look really nice. And while the actual onion part of the plush has some stitching on it just to give it a bit more detail, which actually wasn't necessary, they just added it there just to make it look a bit better. And while for the top part of this plush, they did a really good job making all the colors look really good as well. Some of them don't really fit in together usually, but they did a great job making them blend well. So yeah, they just look really nice, but I do wish if they had some like sort of metal rod in them or made them just a bit more stuffed as well, they look a bit weird. As if they were just slightly more stuffed, in my opinion, they would just look a bit better. Next up we have the Sunbeam. Now, out of every single plush that we're going to look at, this is probably the worst, mainly just because it's just really lacking any details. As though the eyes are basically the only part of the plush that you could actually see, as though this plush actually does have a mouth, but you can't really see it. As though if you look really closely, right under the eyes, you could actually see some yellow stitching. So yeah, for whatever reason, the creators of this plush decided to make the mouth out of a yellow stitching, which was probably the worst decision possible, as it literally blends in with the rest of the plush. And while they could have just made it out of any single other color and it would have looked better than this. But yeah, also the top part of the plush is supposed to be more closer to a white color on the top of the plush, so yeah, it doesn't really have any details unlike the other plushes. As well, basically every single other plush that we're going to look at have all the correct colors to them and also have all the correct details, so this one just doesn't really have that. So yeah, it's probably the worst one that we're going to look at in the entire video. But yeah, moving on to one of the best plushes that we're going to look at, we have the tile turn-up. Now, the reason why I say this is one of the best ones is they just did a really good job with adding the colors and everything. As you can see, in the middle of the white part of the plush, you could actually see some purple felt material added to it, which is just a really nice detail as well. It makes the plush just look slightly better and also just gives it a slight bit more detail. So yeah, they obviously put a lot of work into this one, way more than the others as well. Adding all this different color material already onto another material is just kind of difficult. And while the stem on the top of the plush also looks really good and it has a nice circle around it which seems to be pretty accurate. I don't really know how it's held there as well, but it doesn't really seem to be stitched onto anything, so it's just kind of sitting there. But it's most likely just stitched onto the stem on the back of the plush where we can't really see it. Next up we have the spore shroom. Now, the face on this plush actually looked really good, and once again, it is a very simplistic design, but they did a great job with it. And well, I think they should have done the exact same thing that they did with the Rutabaga plush and also the Stalia plush, which was adding a purple tint into the eyes. As up in the game, the Spore Shroom has a little bit of a purple tint added to the eyes, so I think I should have added that just to make the plush just look a bit more accurate. But besides that one detail that's missing, the rest of the plush looks amazing and they just did a great job with it, just like most of their other plushes. As well, all the purple details added to the head are nicely stitched on and they look really good because, well, they actually stick out of the plush, which gives it a bit more definition and just adds a bit more detail to it. And while the actual shooter part of the plush is just really nicely stuffed and it looks pretty good. And while it seems to have basically been stolen from the Lynx and Fume Shroom plushes, well, but basically uses the exact same design, but that makes sense as well, that's probably the most popular design. So it makes sense why they stole that one detail from the Lynx and plushes, but it just makes it look a lot better. Next up we have the Scaredy Shroom. Now I'm going to be completely honest and say that I don't really like this plush, and there's a few reasons for that. The main reason being is that for some reason it's blue. Now, I really have no idea why they made it blue as well, but it's not actually supposed to be a blue color and it's supposed to be a gray color. So it just gives it a bit of a strange look as though Scaredy Shroom was never meant to be blue in basically anything, so yeah, I have no idea why they did that. And well, for the rest of that part of the plush, the eyes are really nicely stitched on. The shooter part of the plush is basically the exact same as the Spore Shroom, but it actually has a bit more detail to it, which is because the outline of it is just a bit more stuffed, so it actually looks a bit better. But yeah, the eyebrows are made out of a green felt material, which does look accurate, but the actual cap of the plush just doesn't really look that good. As well, it's just really flat and it isn't really stuffed at all, so in my opinion, it just doesn't really look that good. And while all the purple dots on the head look pretty good, as well, they're basically the exact same as the Spore Shroom, so they look really nice and they're really good for definition and detail. And they're really good for just making the plush just look slightly better by adding a bit more detail. But yeah, honestly, this is one of my least favorite plushes out of most of them, mainly just because of the inaccuracies to it. Next up, we have the Sea Shroom. Now, the eyes on this plush look really good because they actually have an eye shine to it. And well, I'm pretty sure it's the only plush out of all of these customs to actually have an eye shine added to it, so it gives it a bit more detail and it looks really nice. And well, for the base of this plush, it also looks pretty good and it looks really accurate, especially because they added some dark green to the edges of some of the pieces just to give it a bit more detail. They also just made this plush really nicely stuffed, so it continues to keep its shape, so it looks pretty good. They also added some dark green circles to the cap of the plush just to give it a bit more detail, and they also added some stitching around it. So yeah, this is also one of the only Sea Shroom custom plushes that I know of, and it's probably the best one that was ever made. So yeah, it's definitely a really unique one. It's one of the better looking plushes. Next up we have Perfume Shroom. Now the eyes on this plush are actually missing the purple eye shine just like the Spore Shroom, as though they're supposed to be a bit of a purple tint to the eyes. So yeah, I don't really know why they added it to some plushes but didn't add it to other plushes, but I think they should have just done that just to give it a bit more detail so it looks nicer. And well, for the cap on this plush, they actually did a really good job with it, as well. You can see the hearts on the side of the plush that are really nicely stitched on. And they actually add a lot of detail to the plush and they look really nice. And well, basically the entire top part of the plush just looks really good and it's really nicely stuffed and all the details look really good. So yeah, they basically just did everything perfect on this plush besides the eyes. So yeah, once again, overall just a really nice looking plush. Next up we have the ice shroom. Now the eyes and mouth on this plush are really nicely stitched on, they look pretty good. And while they also added some ice bits to the bottom of the plush just to give it a bit more detail, and I also like the white part on them just to give it a slight bit of detail just to make it look slightly better. And while they also made all of them just slightly different shapes just to make it a bit more accurate looking and just to give it a bit more detail. And while for the ice spikes on the top of the plush, they did a great job with them as well. They're all really nicely shaped and really nicely stuffed. And while they also added some white stitching to all of the parts of the plush, so it looks really good and they all look really nice as well. All of them are basically shaped differently, so they all look unique. And while this is definitely one of, if not the best Ice Shroom custom plush that I've ever seen. As though there's actually quite a few Ice Shroom custom plushes, but this is definitely the best out of all of them. As though there's just a lot of detail added to the ice spikes just to make them look a lot nicer than the others. So yeah, this definitely has to be one of my favorite plushes out of all of these customs as well, but just looks really good. Next we have the lily pad. Now there's not really much to say about this plush as well. The lily pad is just a very simplistic plush, but they got the shape right on this plush and it looks really good. As well, the eyes have some stitching on and they also come out of the head just to give it a bit more of a 3D look. So yeah, I like the 3D look that they made on this plush, and they just did a really good job with it, and in my opinion, it's one of the better looking custom lily pads. It's definitely not the best, but it's also definitely not the worst, so yeah, once again, just a really nice and simplistic plush. Next up we have the Torchwood. Now, surprisingly, this is one of the only Torchwood plushes that were ever made. Which is really strange, as you would think Torchwood would actually have a few plushes, but it surprisingly doesn't. But yeah, this one is really nicely detailed, as all the details on the face, like the eyes, the mouth, and basically everything is just really nicely made. As though they made it out of a ton of different pieces of felt material, and they just did a great job with it. They also added some extra stitching on the wood just to give it a bit more detail, and it looked really nice. And while for the fire on this plush, they did a great job with it, as though they actually made it really nicely shaped, and they also added some white stitching on it. And while the white stitching outline actually looks really good for that part of the fire, and they did a great job with it. And while it also matches the style of the rest of the plush, so yeah, overall this is definitely one of the best Torchwood plushes that were ever made, as well. I've only ever seen one other. Which is kind of a shame, because Torchwood is actually a really good character, but it sadly barely has any plushes of it. And while this definitely has to be one of the more detailed plushes that we've looked at as well, it just has a lot of details on the face and everything. And while they've clearly put a lot of work into this plush, a lot more than the others. Next we have the Cold Snapdragon. Now, just like the Torchwood, you could obviously tell that they added a lot of stuff to this plush. It's definitely one of the most detailed out of all of these custom plushes. As of the face just has a lot of details on it, including just like the teeth, the extra details for the fur and everything, and they just did a great job with it. As well, the fur actually has a couple of different layers on the back of it just to give it a bit more detail and also make it look more accurate to the game. As well, in the game, the hair has just a really fuzzy look to it, and adding a bunch of different layers to it gives it that look on this plush. And while the eyes also look really good and they have some white stitching on it just to give it a bit more detail. And while you can't really see the eyes of the Cold Snapdragon in the game, so they just did a really good job improvising on how they would actually look. And while the horn on this plush is really nicely stuffed, and all the fur next to it is just really good looking. And while they clearly put a lot of work into this plush compared to the others, as it was one of the most detailed out of every single one of these plushes that they made. And while the only complaint about this plush is that the leaf base just looks really bad. As though this entire plush is just really nicely detailed, and then the leaf base doesn't really have anything. Next up we have the Guacodile. Now the eyes on this plush are really nicely made, and they're also a bit 3D, so they look really good. And while this plush's tail also looks really good as well, even though it's really small, it looks really good. And you can see the spikes and everything they added to it, so yeah, it just gives it a bit more detail, and it looks kind of similar to the teeth for the spikes. As though the teeth basically look the exact same as the spikes, and while they're also just really nicely made, and you could actually see the brown part of the plush inside of the mouth where he shoots out of. And while the only really bad thing about it is that it's supposed to be a lighter brown color, but besides that, the rest of the plush looks amazing. As it is the only Guacodile plush that I've ever seen been made, and that goes for basically every single plush that we've looked at. As well, most of the Plants vs. Zombies 2 plushes don't actually have any other plush to them, so it just looks really good. And well, the mouth is just really nicely shaped, and it also just seems to be really nicely stuffed and has some cardboard in it so you could open and close it. So yeah, just like the other plushes, they just did a really good job with it. It's one of the better looking ones. And well, I'm glad that they made the inside of the mouth just a bit of a lighter shade just to give it a bit more detail and make it stand out a bit more. But yeah, those were all the custom plushes that I found originally from this one place, and there's a lot more custom plushes that I could look at in the future, like websites like Etsy. So yeah, if you want me to do another video like this, you could like and subscribe, and also comment if you want another one. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like and subscribe, and comment down below which of these custom plushes is your favorite, and yeah, have a great day.